Emma Clark had always prided herself on her work ethic. She believed that hard work, dedication, and consistent effort would eventually be recognized. For the past 8 years, she had poured herself into her role as senior analyst at Peak Strategies, a mid-sized marketing firm that she had joined fresh out of college. She had risen through the ranks slowly but steadily, taking on more responsibilities, leading teams and managing high-profile projects. Yet, despite her growth and the obvious impact of her contributions, something never quite clicked when it came to recognition. Each morning, Emma arrived early, her routine always the same, a cup of coffee in hand. She would settle into her desk before the hustle of the office began. She reviewed reports, checked emails, and got to work on her latest project. Emma had built a reputation for being reliable, always there when a team member needed help, always ready to dive into a new project and always finishing tasks ahead of schedule. Her attention to detail and meticulous planning were unmatched, and it was clear that without her, many of the company's projects would not have gone smoothly. But no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much effort she put in, her accomplishments often went unrecognized. It wasn't that Emma didn't get praise she did in small doses. Her boss James would occasionally mention her in meetings, saying that she had done a good job, or that she had helped the team pull through. But those compliments were often fleeting, quickly overshadowed by the louder voices of others in the room. The new hires, the ones who had been with the company for only a fraction of the time, she had seemed to always get the spotlight. They were the ones who were given promotions, new opportunities, and the chance to step into leadership roles. Emma, on the other hand, was always in the background, her hard work overshadowed by those who seemed to be more visible, more vocal. For years, Emma had tried to convince herself that the recognition would come in time. She focused on the work itself, the satisfaction of completing a challenging project, the pride in knowing that she had done it right, and the impact it had on the clients. But as the years passed, it became harder to ignore the feeling that the company was taking her dedication for granted. She was always there, always delivering, but it wasn't enough. Her contributions were so deeply woven into the company's fabric that no one seemed to notice them anymore. She was the unsung hero, the one behind the scenes who made everything run smoothly, but never received the credit she deserved. Her colleagues, particularly Jason, were often the ones who basked in the spotlight. Jason was newer to the team, but he had quickly learned how to work the room, how to speak up in meetings, how to volunteer for high-profile projects, and how to make himself seem indispensable. He was charming, outgoing, and eager to step in front of a crowd. He was exactly what Peak Strategies seemed to be looking for. And over the past few years, he had risen through the ranks quickly. Emma had been passed over for promotions in favor of him, despite the fact that her experience, results, and commitment far exceeded his. It wasn't personal. She told herself it was just the way the game was played. But the more she saw Jason take credit for ideas she had suggested, the more she questioned why her contributions were being ignored. In one particularly difficult project, Emma had spent weeks working tirelessly on a marketing strategy for a high-profile client. She had pored over data, analyzed market trends, and worked with her team to develop a comprehensive, innovative plan that she knew would exceed the client's expectations. When the day came to present the final proposal to the client, Emma was shocked to find that Jason had taken center stage. He spoke confidently, outlining the strategy with enthusiasm, while Emma sat quietly in the background, contributing only when prompted. When the client praised the strategy, Jason received all the credit. Not once did he mention Emma's crucial role in putting the plan together. That night, as she sat at her desk reviewing the feedback from the meeting, Emma felt a wave of frustration wash over her. It wasn't the first time her work had been overshadowed by someone else, but this time felt different. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Peak Strategies had taken her for granted for far too long. They had never fully appreciated what she brought to the table, not just in terms of the work she did, but the reliability, the commitment, and the loyalty she had shown over the years. She had been passed over for promotions, ignored in meetings, and left out of decisions that directly impacted her projects. Despite all of this, she had continued to work hard. Putting the company's needs above her own, she had thought that her work would speak for itself, that one day the higher-ups would realize her worth. But now, sitting at her desk, she realized something crucial. They weren't going to notice. They had already decided who was valuable to them, and it wasn't her. That realization hit Emma like a cold wave. She had dedicated 8 years of her life to a company that never truly saw her, a company that took her efforts for granted and failed to recognize the very things that made her indispensable. It was in that moment that Emma made a decision that would change the course of her career and ultimately her life. She would no longer wait for the recognition that was so long overdue. It was time for a change. The months following the growing frustration in Emma's work life were filled with a constant battle of emotions. At first, she had hoped that things would change, that perhaps if she just kept working harder, kept proving herself, eventually someone would take notice. But the more she poured herself into her job, the more she realized that she was stuck in a cycle of exhaustion and underappreciation. No matter how much effort she put in, the recognition she craved was always just out of reach. The breaking point came unexpectedly during a routine team meeting. Emma had spent the past several weeks working on an ambitious campaign for one of their major clients. She had meticulously crafted the strategy, designed the pitch, and worked closely with her team to ensure everything was perfect. This was the kind of project that could elevate her career. It had the potential to make a significant impact on the client's business, and in turn, her standing within the company. Emma had high hopes for the presentation. She knew her work was solid, and she believed the client would be impressed. But when the meeting day arrived, Emma's hopes were dashed. The room was filled with the usual faces: her manager James, the senior executives, and her colleagues. But this time, the vibe was different. It wasn't the usual collaborative environment she had come to expect. Instead, there was an air of impatience, as though everyone was just waiting for the meeting to be over. Emma began to present the campaign to the room, carefully outlining the research, the strategy, and the expected outcomes. As she spoke, she could feel a subtle shift in the room, a lack of engagement, almost as though they were all waiting for her to finish so they could move on to the next topic. At the end of the presentation, James barely acknowledged her work. "Thanks for the update." "Emma," he said, curtly, already moving on to the next agenda item. There was no praise for the effort she had put into the campaign, no recognition of how much work had gone into the presentation. Instead, Jason, who had only minimally contributed to the project, jumped in with a few ideas of his own, attempting to steer the conversation toward changes he wanted to make. His suggestions, though less thought out, were met with immediate approval from the higher-ups. Emma sat there, her heart sinking. She could feel the weight of the years of hard work and dedication that had led her to this point. She had poured everything into this campaign, and yet once again, she was overlooked in favor of others who quite frankly hadn't earned it. But it wasn't just the lack of acknowledgement that stung. It was the recognition that no matter how much effort she put in, no matter how much she cared, Peak Strategies would never appreciate her. She had been putting in 110%, but all she was getting in return was indifference and frustration. As the meeting ended, Emma quietly packed up her things and left the room. The exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders, and the bitterness she had been feeling for so long now felt almost unbearable. As she walked back to her desk, she overheard a conversation between James and Jason. "I think we should have Jason take over the client account," James said, dismissing Emma's role in the project entirely. "He's been more vocal in meetings, and we need someone who can really drive things forward." Emma's stomach churned. This was the final blow. The moment she realized that no matter how many hours she put in, no matter how hard she tried to make a difference, she would always be overlooked. The company had made it clear that they didn't value her. They didn't see the work she put in, the sacrifices she made, or the results she delivered. That afternoon, as Emma sat at her desk, staring blankly at her computer screen, the thought of leaving began to creep into her mind. She had been so loyal to Peak Strategies, always giving her best, always striving for excellence. But after years of dedication, she realized she was stuck. No one was going to acknowledge her unless she demanded it. And even then, it might not make a difference. Her dreams of growing within the company, of moving up the ranks, had been dashed long ago. The constant cycle of giving her all only to watch others take the credit had taken its toll. She began to think about her future. What did she want? What was she really working for? The vision of her career path within Peak Strategies felt suffocating. Emma's ambitions had always been about growth, personal, professional, and creative. But she was stuck in a place where growth seemed impossible. She had come to a crossroads. The thought of leaving was terrifying. It meant stepping into the unknown, leaving behind the security of a job she had worked for almost a decade to build. But it also meant the possibility of a fresh start, of finding a path where her skills, her passion, and her efforts could be truly valued. The idea of starting over wasn't as daunting as it once seemed. She had spent years building expertise in her field, and she had developed a side hustle that, though small, had the potential to grow into something meaningful. That evening, after a long day, Emma sat down with Lily. Her best friend? They'd had many conversations about Emma's career. Frustrations, but this time the conversation felt different. "I think it's time," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "I'm done. I need to leave. I can't keep doing this to myself." Lily listened intently, her eyes understanding. "You've been unhappy for too long, and you've already been building something on the side, haven't you? Maybe it's time to go all in and make it your own." Emma nodded. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her chest. She had been afraid of the uncertainty, afraid of taking that leap, but now she realized that the real risk was staying. Staying in a job where she wasn't valued, where her work didn't matter, and where her future felt uncertain, because the company wouldn't even give her the chance to grow. That night, Emma made the decision. The following morning, she would hand in her resignation. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she knew that staying in a job that drained her would never lead to the fulfillment she was seeking. It was time for her to take control of her own path. The morning after Emma made the decision to leave Peak Strategies, the weight of it all started to settle in. The thought of walking away from a job she had dedicated almost a decade to was overwhelming. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she stared at the resignation letter she had written the night before, questioning whether she was making the right choice. The act of resigning was symbolic, a decision to take control of her future, but it also felt like stepping into the unknown, a leap of faith she wasn't entirely sure she was ready to make. Still, there was a sense of resolve in her decision. The years of hard work, the late nights, the weekends spent working on projects that were later ignored or attributed to someone else. It had all built up to this moment. She had given so much of herself to a company that had never truly recognized her value. Now the time had come to reclaim her worth. Emma had reached the point where staying felt like suffocating. Leaving felt like freedom. She printed out the resignation letter and walked to James's office, her steps slow and deliberate. The familiar hallway that she had walked down 1,000 times before now felt foreign. It wasn't just the physical space that was shifting, it was her entire perspective. The very office where she had spent so many hours felt like a prison. Emma had spent years seeking approval and recognition here, but today she was walking away from it all. No more second-guessing. No more waiting for things to change. When she entered James's office, he looked up from his desk, surprised to see her standing there, a serious expression on her face. Emma closed the door gently behind her. "I'm resigning," she said simply, handing him the letter. The words, though carefully chosen, still hung heavy in the air. For a moment, James was silent. Emma could see the shock in his eyes. He had always known Emma as the reliable, quiet worker who never made waves. He didn't expect her to walk away. After a few seconds, he took the letter from her hand, scanning it quickly. "I didn't see this coming," he said, his voice uncertain. "Why are you leaving Emma?" Emma could have told him everything, the frustration, the years of being overlooked, the feeling of being invisible. She could have laid out the numerous projects she had worked on, only to see others take credit for them, the lack of acknowledgement from leadership, the betrayal she felt when Jason had been promoted ahead of her. But instead, she simply shook her head. "I don't feel like I'm being appreciated here. My work isn't valued, and I'm done waiting for recognition that never comes. I need to do something for myself, James. It's time for me to move on." James seemed taken aback. He was quiet for a long time, clearly trying to process what she was saying. "Is there anything we can do to change your mind? A new role, more responsibility?" He asked, the desperation in his voice more than a little obvious. Emma could see the shift in his tone, the realization that Emma wasn't just another employee to be replaced. She was a part of the team's success, but it was too late. "I've made up my mind. I can't stay here and continue pretending that everything is fine when it's not. I need to move on. For my own sanity, I need to step away." James sighed, clearly disappointed, but perhaps also understanding, though Emma could see the faint traces of guilt in his expression. "I understand," he said, although his words felt hollow. "I'm sorry it had to end like this. You've been a great asset to the company. Emma, we'll miss you." Emma didn't respond right away. She took one last look at him, at the person who had watched her grow in the company, who had been her manager for so long, yet never truly saw her. She had given years of dedication only for it to be tossed aside as if it were nothing. Emma turned slowly and walked out of his office, leaving the resignation letter behind. As she walked back to her desk, she felt a strange sense of finality, a closure she hadn't anticipated. She packed her belongings in silence, taking the framed photo of her and her team from the desk, the small trinkets that decorated the space she had once considered her own. The office, once a symbol of her career's progression, now felt like an empty shell. Her colleagues, the few who were there at that hour, glanced over as she packed up. Some offered words of sympathy, others simply nodded. There was no grand goodbye, no tearful farewells. Emma was just another employee leaving her departure, no different from the others who had come and gone before her. Jason, who had never once acknowledged the work she had done, stopped by her desk to ask if she was really leaving. There was no apology, no recognition of the effort she had put into the company, only an indifferent curiosity. He didn't seem to fully grasp that the person he had so casually overshadowed had finally decided to walk away. It wasn't long before Emma's box was packed, her desk cleared, and her time at Peak Strategies officially over. She handed in her security badge and walked toward the exit. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the crushing weight of responsibility hanging over her. There was no anxiety about an upcoming deadline, no worry about being ignored in a meeting, no fear of her contributions being minimized. She had walked away from it all. As the doors closed behind her, Emma paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that she had made the right decision. The uncertainty that once seemed terrifying now felt like the opening of a new chapter, one that was entirely hers to write. With a final glance back at the building she had spent so many years in, Emma got into her car and drove away. She wasn't looking back anymore. The career she had once dreamed of at Peak Strategies was over, but in its place was a new beginning, one that she had earned on her own terms. In the weeks following Emma's departure from Peak Strategies, the company moved on with startling speed. The transition was swift, almost seamless, so much so that it felt as though Emma had never been a part of the team at all. Her desk was cleared, her role filled by someone else, and soon after the routine at the office resumed as if nothing had changed. But as time went on, it became increasingly apparent that Peak Strategies was struggling without her, and the reality of what they had lost began to sink in. At first it was small things. The tight-knit team Emma had worked with so closely in the past seemed disjointed without her. Meetings that used to be collaborative now felt rushed and inefficient. Her absence in the brainstorming sessions left a noticeable gap, and the quality of their ideas and strategies seemed to drop. Emma's ability to lead discussions, mediate between conflicting opinions, and keep projects moving forward had been understated while she was there. Now that she was gone, it was glaringly obvious how much her presence had grounded the team. In the months that followed, the company began to feel the effects of her departure more acutely. Jason, the colleague who had risen through the ranks ahead of her, was struggling to manage the projects she had once overseen. With ease, his inexperience was starting to show. Clients were becoming dissatisfied with the lack of strategic direction, and deadlines were being missed. The company had tried to assign other team members to fill in for Emma, but no one seemed to have the same drive, attention to detail, or deep understanding of client needs. One particularly telling moment came during a critical presentation to a major client. The client had been one of Emma's favorites, a project she had poured hours into, ensuring every detail was aligned with their vision. Now Jason was left to present the revised strategy. Emma had always been the one to manage delicate relationships with key clients, providing them with thoughtful solutions and clear communication. But Jason, though well-meaning, couldn't manage the pressure in the same way. He stumbled through the presentation, lacking the confidence and insight that Emma had always brought to the table. The client, visibly frustrated, asked for more concrete answers and clearer strategies. The meeting ended without any real progress, and the deal, which had once seemed secure, was now hanging in the balance. As the feedback from the meeting circulated, James, the manager who had always appreciated Emma's efforts, began to realize just how much she had contributed. He started hearing from other departments about the growing gaps in performance. Emma's ability to juggle multiple projects, her foresight in client relations, and her leadership in tough situations had been invaluable. And now, with those qualities absent, the company was struggling to keep things running smoothly. It didn't take long before James started reflecting on the mistakes he had made, how he had taken Emma's dedication for granted, how he had overlooked her potential for years. There had always been excuses, reasons to push her down the ladder in favor of others who had been louder, more outwardly confident. But now he was forced to confront the truth. Emma had been a pillar of the company, and they had allowed her to slip through their fingers. One afternoon, James sat in his office reviewing the latest client complaints and the struggling project timelines. His mind kept drifting back to Emma, to her work ethic, her attention to detail, and her ability to get things done. He hadn't fully appreciated how indispensable she had been. He had assumed she would always be there, just like she had always been. He had taken her for granted. It was then that he realized how much he had lost. Emma wasn't just another employee who had decided to leave. She was a linchpin in the company's operations. Her departure had left a hole that was now impossible to fill with a single person, especially with someone as inexperienced as Jason. As weeks turned into months, the company's struggle only deepened. The clients Emma had nurtured were starting to pull back their trust, in peak strategies eroding as they saw the decline in the quality of service. James began to field more complaints than he had in years, and his once confident demeanor started to show cracks. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he reached out to Emma. The message was brief, almost hesitant. "I hope you're doing well. I just wanted to say, thank you for everything you did while you were here. I've come to realize how much we took you for granted, and I regret that." Emma received the email with a sense of satisfaction that she hadn't anticipated. She read the words carefully, but didn't feel the need to respond right away. She had moved on, and the bitterness she had once carried with her had faded. This was the recognition she had waited for so long, but it came too late. Emma knew that this was the company's way of trying to make amends, but for her, it was no longer enough. The moment of realization that had hit James and the leadership team wasn't one she could accept as her own victory. She had already walked away, and that was where her story had begun anew. Despite the satisfaction of knowing that her contributions had been recognized, Emma wasn't looking back. Her career had already shifted in a direction that she could be proud of. Her new business was thriving, and she was finally being recognized for the skills and dedication she had always carried. As time passed, Emma continued to hear from former colleagues who had left Peak Strategies or moved on to other opportunities. They told her about the ongoing struggles of the company, how morale was low, how leadership was scrambling to salvage projects, and how they all missed the stability she had once brought. It wasn't just the day-to-day tasks that had fallen apart without Emma. It was the culture of the company, the way things had once flowed seamlessly when she was there, that had been disrupted. Emma's heart no longer ached for those who had ignored her for so long. She had come to understand that Peak Strategies' loss was not her fault. It was theirs. They had made their choices, and they had failed to see what was right in front of them. But that didn't matter anymore. Emma had moved on, and the future she was building was hers, and hers alone. As the weeks passed after Emma's departure from Peak Strategies, the initial shock of leaving her longtime job began to fade, and she found herself settling into a rhythm she hadn't experienced in years. The uncertainty that once loomed over her now felt like a distant memory. Instead of the constant stress and burnout that had plagued her, she was now greeted with a sense of freedom and possibility. Each day she was able to wake up and focus on her own goals, her own passions, and most importantly, her own growth. Emma's new business, Clark Digital Consulting, was thriving. What had started as a side hustle helping small businesses with digital marketing strategies had quickly turned into a full-time venture. Her client list was growing steadily, and with every new project, she felt more confident in her ability to lead and innovate. The freedom of being her own boss brought a renewed sense of purpose to her life, one that she hadn't realized she had been missing in her corporate job. The work she did now was driven by her own values and vision, not by the expectations of others. Her transition into entrepreneurship wasn't without its challenges, but Emma had learned to embrace them. She had once feared that leaving Peak Strategies would mean starting from scratch, but now she saw every challenge as an opportunity to grow and refine her skills. She spent hours each day learning about new marketing trends, business strategies, and ways to improve her offerings. She took on clients in industries she hadn't worked with, before expanding her knowledge and becoming more versatile as a digital consultant. There was no corporate ladder to climb anymore. Instead, Emma was building her own path, brick by brick. One of the things that surprised Emma the most was how much more fulfilling her work felt. She wasn't just executing tasks for clients. She was shaping their businesses, helping them achieve goals they had once thought were out of reach. Her work had a real, tangible impact. She saw the results of her strategies firsthand, whether it was an increase in sales for a local business or a boost in social media, engagement for a startup, These successes were hers earned through her own efforts and creativity. Alongside her growing business, Emma also found herself reconnecting with her personal life in ways she hadn't in years. She spent more time with her family, taking weekend trips with her partner, and reconnecting with friends she had lost touch with during her demanding years at Peak Strategies. Her new schedule, though, still busy, allowed her to prioritize the things that truly mattered. She could go for a run in the morning, read a book in the evening, or cook a meal without feeling guilty or rushed. The pressure to constantly prove herself had melted away, replaced by a newfound balance and sense of fulfillment. But the biggest change wasn't just in her work or her time management. It was in her confidence. Emma had spent so long doubting her own worth at Peak Strategies, waiting for someone else to recognize her efforts. Now she was the one in control of her success. She was calling the shots, and for the first time in her life, she felt empowered to make decisions without needing permission or approval from anyone else. This newfound confidence spread beyond her professional life. She started to assert herself more in personal situations, setting boundaries, asking for what she deserved, and no longer letting others take advantage of her. One of the most gratifying moments came when she received an email from Lily, her best friend who had been following Emma's journey closely. "I knew you had it in you," Lily wrote. "I always believed you were meant for something bigger, and now you're doing it. I'm so proud of you." Emma read the message with a smile, feeling the warmth of validation from someone who had supported her all along. But what struck her the most was that she no longer needed validation from others in the way she once did. She had found her own self-worth, and it was enough. The success of her new business was also starting to gain attention. In the industry, Emma was invited to speak at local entrepreneur events, sharing her story of transitioning from corporate life to entrepreneurship. Her insights into digital marketing and business development resonated with other aspiring entrepreneurs, many of whom were stuck in corporate jobs they didn't love, just like she had been. Emma's story became one of inspiration, a reminder that it was never too late to make a change, to pursue what truly mattered, and to build a career that aligned with one's values. As her business continued to grow, Emma began to consider how she could scale. She wanted to help more businesses and create a lasting impact. She started to bring in a small team to help manage her increasing workload, hiring people who shared her vision and passion for helping businesses thrive. It was a new experience, delegating work, building a team, and creating a company culture. But it was one she embraced wholeheartedly. She also began to think about giving back. After experiencing firsthand how important it was to have mentors and support, Emma started offering free workshops for local startups and aspiring entrepreneurs. She wanted to pay it forward, helping others avoid the struggles she had faced in her previous job, and providing them with the tools they needed to succeed on their own terms. In every way, Emma's life had transformed. What had once felt like the end, her departure from Peak Strategies had turned out to be just the beginning. She had stepped out of a job that no longer served her, walked away from a career that had never truly recognized her worth, and into a life where she was in charge. She was no longer defined by a job title or by the company that had once employed her. She had created her own identity, one built on passion, self-respect, and the courage to forge her own path. Looking back, Emma didn't regret her decision to leave. Leaving had been the hardest thing she had ever done, but it had opened doors she never thought possible. The future was now full of potential, and Emma was ready to embrace whatever came next. Her journey had been one of resilience, but more than that, it had been a journey of self-discovery. Emma now knew that her success wasn't defined by her job at Peak Strategies or by anyone else's recognition. It was defined by the choices she made, the risks she took, and the work she did to build a life that was truly her own.